The 11th game week of the Premier League takes place this weekend, and it's time to predict every single game of this round, starting off with Tottenham Hotspur against Manchester United. And this will be an interesting one, I think. Of course, it's a replay of last season's Europa League final, which Tottenham claimed a 1-0 win in. But I don't expect this game to go the same. I have to say that Tottenham, even though they're sitting at sixth here in the table, I've not been impressed at all. I mean, their first few games were alright, but recently, when we look at their form here, the Chelsea game was atrocious, in my opinion, even though they only lost 1-0, but they created very little, and it was a very, very poor performance. Likewise with the Newcastle game. Sure, the Everton one took me a bit by surprise, but as we've seen recently with Everton, they aren't the best team. And all in all, Tottenham have been quite poor. The results have been alright, but the games themselves have looked everything else but impressive. Manchester United, on the other side, have been a bit better. The table doesn't reflect it, but almost the opposite. The results haven't been the best, but the playing style in most of their games has been good. They have been able to adapt somewhat against their opposition, and a big point with Manchester United is their midfield, which does struggle against good midfields. But Spurs has won, not on paper, but in the actual games, Spurs are one of the worst midfields in the entire Premier League, in my opinion. It shouldn't be. Bentancur, Palinha, Sar, if this is how they line up, or even if you play like a Bissouma, I think is injured right now. But their midfield shouldn't be anywhere near as bad as it actually is in games. So that's also something I think goes in Manchester United's favor. That maybe Bruno Fernandes and Casemiro won't get as exposed here as they have been in some other games when they face stronger midfields. And all in all, I think that the edge from Embuemo and Cunha in Manchester United, and the fact that their defense has been quite good, and I don't see Tottenham being able to put too much effort onto the Manchester United defenders here, and I'm going to predict a 2-1 Manchester United away win. Next up, we have a real Premier League classic as Everton take on Fulham at home. And I expect this to be quite a narrow game, I have to say. Two quite defensive teams most often. And Everton, I haven't been too impressed by them so far, to be honest. I think that the results they've managed to get are a lot because of their individual strength, with players like India and Grealish just almost carrying the team on their shoulders, and the likes of Pickford and Tarkovsky does a lot of the defensive work. It's not so much a team performance often by Everton, and that's something that I will get caught up to them in the long run, to be honest. Fulham, though, haven't been as good as I expected them to be this season, but they got the 3-0 win last weekend against Wolves when they sacked Pereira. So that's, of course, impressive. Can they build on that form? I would have to say I do favor Fulham in this matchup, but going away at Everton is quite difficult, and Everton are often very, very defensive, even when they play lesser known teams such as Fulham compared to the bigger teams. My prediction would be a 1-1 draw here. And then moving on to two of the worst teams in the entire Premier League, in my opinion. West Ham taking on Burnley at home. And this is a game I won't be watching, not gonna lie to you. I mean, these two teams have been everything else than impressive this season. West Ham United, of course, got the win last weekend against Newcastle. Quite impressive. However, I would argue personally from watching that game that more came down to Newcastle being extremely poor than West Ham doing anything good. Of course, it's impressive to score 3 goals, but I see that more as a one-time off than the start of something new, if I'm gonna be honest. And I don't have a lot of trust in Nuno as a coach either. Burnley, though, they have played over their XG, meaning that they've scored more than they really should have, if you consider the chances they've had. But they have been quite solid. When they come up against the better teams, they do seem to struggle. But West Ham is a reasonably winnable game, in my opinion, for Burnley, because they have beaten teams like Wolves and even Leeds, who I consider actually to be better than West Ham this season so far. So I don't think that you should be counting out Burnley here this week, even though I think a lot of people will, just because of the 3-1 win from West Ham against Newcastle. Again, though, Burnley away seem to be very, very defensive and almost always happy with getting a point. So I'm not going to be as boring as predicting a nil-nil here, but I'm gonna predict a 1-1 draw. Moving on to a far more exciting game, we have Sunderland taking on Arsenal at the Stadium of Light. And I wouldn't be too surprised if Sunderland gets something here. However, when it comes to my prediction, I'm gonna have to pick Arsenal. Of course, I do, because they've been so incredibly solid this season. But you should not underestimate Sunderland, and I don't think that many people do these days, since they sit at fourth here in the Premier League, which is, yeah, it's just amazing considering their budget and the size of the club, and the fact that most people would have them going down at the start of the season. And maybe they will, but the start has been incredibly good from Sunderland. And I just think a home game against a big team, the fans will be up for this one. So I expect it to be quite a stale game, to be honest, because Arsenal are incredibly defensive and, may I say it, quite boring actually. Sunderland, though, they like to play on the counter, as we saw a bit against Chelsea when they claimed that win there. Like I said, I have to predict an Arsenal win, but I'm gonna go a 1-0 away win from Arsenal. But I gotta say, I hope for an upset here. And then the final game of the Saturday is Chelsea taking on Wolves at home. And as of recording this, it hasn't been announced who Wolves' new coach will be. Of course, like I said, Pereira got sacked last weekend following the defeat to Fulham. And will they be able to get a new manager bounce? I actually don't think that they will have a new coach on the sideline in time for Saturday, so it will probably be an interim manager. But sometimes that can be enough to get a bit of a bounce. Chelsea is a team that is, of course, very, very solid, but I think they seem to do better against better opposition in some weird way when they play these lesser known teams like Sunderland, even though Sunderland are very good. They sometimes underestimate them and struggle a bit more than they should have. But I think that they'll get this one done, and I'm gonna predict a 2-1 Chelsea win. Moving swiftly on to the Sunday, where we have Aston Villa taking on Bournemouth at home, and this is, in my opinion, one of the most exciting games of the entire week, just because of the strategic masterminds in charge of both teams. To be honest, both Unai Emery and Raiola are incredibly capable of switching up their team's strategies depending on the opposition. Something that I don't think every Premier League manager does, even though it sounds quite basic. Some just like to stick with their strategy no matter opposition because they think it's the best to face everyone. But these two don't seem to do that, and I think that's one of their biggest strengths, to be honest. But how will they approach this game? Aston Villa typically like to have the bit more possession, and Bournemouth enjoy playing on the counter with quick players like Semenyo. I think that's what we should expect on Sunday as well. And it's gonna be interesting. I mean, two really, really solid teams and a very hard game to predict. I would understand if you lean towards Aston Villa since they play at home and they seem to be very strong at Villa Park, especially recently. But Bournemouth are a team that should never be underestimated and can basically beat anyone on their day. However, I've not been as impressed by Bournemouth recently as I've been for a few games on the start of the season, and Villa has looked a lot better than they did in the beginning. Tough one this. I'm gonna predict a 1-1 draw. Next up, we have two teams who both lost last week, Brentford against Newcastle, and this is also quite a difficult one to predict, in my opinion. Brentford have had a much better season than at least I would have thought, and Newcastle have been a bit worse than I expected, even though it hasn't been a calamity. It hasn't been great for Newcastle. I mean, Voltemade is probably one of the only bright spots for them, and he has been very, very good. But you need more than a solid striker to win games. And last time out against West Ham, I mean, just a completely embarrassing loss for Newcastle there. However, I'm choosing to believe that there was more of just a one-off loss than a sign of things to come. But maybe it is the start of a very bad period for Newcastle. Hard to say. I'm very impressed by Newcastle at home, but away I think they look a lot more shaky when they don't have St James's Park in the back cheering them on. And I'm gonna go with the 2-1 Brentford win because I just think that Brentford's playing style as well, it really suits them coming up against teams like Newcastle. And Keith Andrews has gotten it spot on with his tactics as far as this season goes. So 2-1 is my underdog pick of the week. Moving on to a very intriguing matchup, in my opinion. We have Crystal Palace taking on Brighton, and it's a shame that this is on at the same time as the Brentford and Villa game, because I think this will be a very, very interesting strategic matchup here, just because of the fact that Crystal Palace's playing style really suits them playing teams like Brighton, when they can sit back, let the opposition have a bit more possession, and then punish them on the counter. That's what Palace love to do. However, Brighton seem to do the best when they are the ones having the possession. So the opposition here suits the other team very well, which is not something we always see in this kinds of matchups. So how will this one play out? Personally, I would favor Crystal Palace. I think that they are just a better team here, especially at home at Selhurst Park, and the individual quality impresses me a lot more than it does at Brighton, to be honest, even though value wise they're probably at the same, the two squads. I reckon that Palace will get this one done and come out victorious with a 3-1 win on Sunday. Moving on, we have Nottingham Forest taking on Leeds at home. And is this the time where Sean Dyche gets his first win as Nottingham Forest coach in the Premier League? Quite possibly. I have been quite impressed by Leeds, not gonna lie. At the start of the season, they've been a lot better than I expected them to be. However, that defeat away against Brighton really, really disappointed me. I thought that their playing style could punish Brighton away, even though Brighton are a better team than Leeds. But they just didn't deliver. And most would argue that Brighton are a bit of a better side than Forest, so maybe Leeds can do well here. And Nottingham Forest have had a bit of an injury crisis recently. Adding to that was Douglas Luiz, of course, going off injured against Manchester United. But I do have to say that I do favor Forest here. I think at the City ground, with the crowd in their back, opposition like Leeds, this is where they need to take their points. And Sean Dyche has really gotten his spirit into the Forest side this quickly, and he's really organized his squad in quite an impressive way, I do have to say. And mainly for that reason, I'm going to predict a 2-0 Forest win. And then to finish off, we have basically the biggest game in the Premier League over the last 10 years. Manchester City playing Liverpool at home. And I'm going to favor Manchester City here. I'm just going to say it. Mainly because Liverpool's defense has looked very, very shaky this season. And that's against the likes of Brentford and Manchester United, just to name a few. To then switch from that to playing against Manchester City and mainly Erling Haaland. I mean, good luck, Van Dijk and Konate. Erling Haaland in the game against Bournemouth, especially, it just struck me again. How he moves like that as such a big man and with his body composition is incredibly, incredibly strange. I can't get it personally. He's somewhat of a freak in the best way possible. Erling Haaland to be that big, that quick, of course, is very strong as well and has just an eye for goal that not a lot of people have in the Premier League. And I reckon he will cause Liverpool all sorts of problem come Sunday night. So my prediction here would be a 2-1 Manchester City win. Of course, Liverpool are that good that they can pull something out of the bag. Ekitike and Gakpo have started the season really well, but Mohamed Salah is just a shadow of his former self, really. Maybe he needs a big game like this to step up, but none of the other games have made him step up, so I doubt he will do that come this away game at the Etihad. But I suppose you should never count out Liverpool, and I don't think they should be such a big underdog as they are. But my prediction is a 2-1 Manchester City win. So those are my final predictions for the 11th round of the Premier League. Keep an eye out, as I mentioned, for mainly the Aston Villa against Bournemouth or Palace against Brighton. Unfortunately, they are on at the same times, but I think those two will be hidden gems in this game week and followed by the classic City against Liverpool. So for once, the Sunday here is the big Premier League day, but of course the Saturday as well. Tottenham against United. Maybe not the highest quality of football, but hopefully very, very entertaining at least. And maybe, this is the week where Arsenal lose their winning streak. Who knows? But thank you a lot for listening, and I'll catch you guys next week.